My name is Tony Plahetsky, and I'm a reporter here in Austin. I work for the Austin American-Statesman and for KVUE Television. So I cover the Austin bombings really from day one. It was a 19-day span in which a serial bomber essentially attacked Austin. He began on the morning of Friday, March 2nd, 2018, and he continued until law enforcement closed in on him in the early morning hours of Wednesday, March 21st, 2018. And as law enforcement closed in on him, he actually used a bomb that he had in his possession to detonate and kill himself. The victims of the crimes were, there were a number of victims. 2 victims were killed. The first one was 39-year-old Stephen Anthony House, and the other victim was 17-year-old Draylon Mason. They were both killed by pipe bombs left at their doorsteps, but there were a number of other victims who were seriously wounded. Among them was 75-year-old Hope Herrera. She was severely injured on the morning of March 12, 2018. And then in addition to that, 2 other young men were severely injured in a Travis Country explosion, an explosion in the Travis Country neighborhood. And that device used a tripwire that they inadvertently tripped, and that set off a bomb that injured both of them. And there were a couple of other injuries as well that were more minor in nature. A FedEx employee had some minor injuries after a bomb detonated at a distribution facility in Schertz, Texas. That's about 65 miles away from Austin. Well, I think that, the Austin bombings was certainly a time when emotions in our community really ran the gamut. A lot of people were very, very scared, and I think that was probably an appropriate response. There were a lot of unknowns about who this person was, why they were doing it, who he was targeting, and so I think certainly fear was an appropriate response that a lot of people felt. I think a lot of people also felt very angry, particularly as this went on, that someone was trying to make a statement, perhaps. That was a question that I think a lot of people had. But I also think there was just at its core a search for understanding as well.
My main thoughts during the time of the Austin bombing were 2 things. One, fear, because I lived in a neighborhood that was mostly black and brown, like the neighborhoods of those who were first targeted, and I felt like it was potentially a hate crime that was done completely randomly in communities of color, and I really felt like, I definitely couldn't open packages, and I was very scared. I also felt very sad for the victims and felt like they didn't get a lot of press, and I felt frustrated and sad that the victims weren't the story.
It was an interesting feeling. What I was thinking when the events were going on was, gosh, that's awful, but at the same time, I felt like, even though it was in Austin, how is that ever going to get to me? Because I had never seen it in person, or I'd never really heard about it firsthand. I'd heard it on the news and on TV and things like that, but it felt sort of distant from me.
So I think one thing that a lot of people still ask in this case who live in the Austin community is why. And people, we've told people that law enforcement says that we will likely never know why. But I still think that despite law enforcement sort of saying that publicly, people are still either not hearing that or find it difficult to accept that we may never know why the bomber did this. All of the information shows that this was totally random. The people and the homes that were chosen for these bombs were totally random. There was an investigative angle that investigators took early on in this investigation after bombings 1 through 3, because those were all minorities. The first 2 victims were African American, the 3rd victim was Hispanic, and so there was a concern early in the investigation, and maybe up to the midway point in the investigation, that whoever was doing this was targeting minorities. But then that investigative theory really did not pan out once the bomber struck the Travis Country neighborhood, because that was a blast that could have hurt anyone, and the 2 victims were in fact white males. I think that This case illustrates that there are dangerous people among us. There will always be dangerous people among us. And trying to get ahead of those people, I think, is a very, very difficult proposition. I think one of the most haunting things about this case is that there's security video and surveillance video from him going to stores in Austin buying his bomb-making material. And when you watch those videos, you really do see how he's moving about the general public in some of these stores who were, people there buying batteries or home supplies, nails, and he's there, clearly with a much more sinister motive. The confession video has been the subject of some degree of debate in the Austin community about whether or not it should be made public. No one except law enforcement, and in fact a very small number of law enforcement officials, have actually heard the confession tape. The police chief here in Austin has chosen not to release it, and he has the authority under Texas law to not release it. We've had discussions with law enforcement about whether or not they would be willing to release a transcript of the audio confession, and at this point the answer remains no.
I think preventing things like this would be more challenging, because just people can find ways around a lot of things. It would take a long time to think of a preventative measure that would actually work really well, but I think we can. It would just take a long time or take a lot of planning and thinking.
It's also very, very hard to know what someone is doing in the cover of darkness in their own bedroom, at their own home, where they were padlocking their door so that their roommates didn't know what was going on inside their home. I think law enforcement would tell you that prevention, for something like this is exceedingly challenging, but that once it started, their big motivation was trying to stop it from getting worse or from going any further. I think the question of whether or not to release a suspect's name or to release a lot of information about a suspect, particularly after a serial crime like the Austin bombings, remains a question for journalists. We believe our job is to tell as much as we can and to provide the biggest body of work as we can.